Here's 15 lifestyle habits that I follow to take care of my brain. If you ask me, one of the biggest problems that we face today is we do not prioritize the health of our brain. We think of it as an afterthought. And after talking with countless psychiatrists and Harvard psychiatrists and people that really know what they're talking about, I've realized that I need to prioritize my brain more than anything. So here's what I do, ranging from food, lifestyle, interventions, things like that. First off, I eat a ton of blueberries, like a lot of them. And they're so low carb, I can get away with eating quite a few, even if I'm following a lower carb protocol. Also, I'm a data-driven guy, and there is so much strong data backing up the potency of anthocyanins. That's what gives them the dark pigment. That's a polyphenol that seems to be able to cross the blood-brain barrier, has neuroinflammatory protective properties, also seems to have BDNF producing properties where it helps the brain actually potentially grow. So huge benefits, and it's short-term and long-term. I feel the effects really quickly. I usually mix them in cottage cheese and it's good to go. This next one is kind of an interesting one, and it's not meditation, but it's something that anyone can do even if you're not a meditator. And that is what I call non-reacting. Okay, what that simply is taking 5 minutes and sitting down and literally not reacting to anything. You have an itch on your face, don't itch your face. You have a twitch in your leg, don't move your leg. You have a thought that pops into your head, don't react to it. Literally try not to move a muscle. It sounds so stupid, but the act of non-reacting is an active form of meditation. Whereas a lot of times people, when they meditate, they feel like they need to get into this specific zone and they need to learn all these things. Simply not reacting can reset your dopamine baseline. Dopamine is going to measure your immediate past with your immediate present. So what just happened and how you react to it, and did you get satisfaction out of doing something to solve that itch, good or bad? So if you have an itch and you don't scratch it, you actually build some resilience there. It's a really neat thing to try. Next up is I get adequate sodium in. We have to remember that sodium is what signals that entire signal transduction to make an actual action happen. So for my brain to send a signal to my bicep or my quadricep, it requires sodium for that action potential to actually reach my leg or reach my arm. But the same thing is happening between our neurons in our brain. And for neurochemical signaling and for all this to occur, we need adequate sodium. So if I'm sweating a lot and I'm not replenishing sodium, then it's a problem. Now, above and beyond that, between 500 and 800 milligrams per day of magnesium. The one that I typically use is either a magnesium glycinate because it can cross the blood-brain barrier, or what is called a dimagnesium malate, which is a more sustained release magnesium. I recommend starting at 400 or 500 milligrams and working your way up to about 800, and you should feel calm, cool, and collected. The next thing that I do a lot of is sauna. Now, this is for good reason. Sauna obviously is good for blood flow, good for heat shock proteins, it's good for building resilience, but an area that people do not talk about a lot, and something that I learned working with special operations with the Army, is how it affects what's called the glymphatic system. So when you go in a high heat sauna, it creates more intracranial pressure. What that means is the high heat is creating some pressure in your brain that is allowing this system in the brain that doesn't really rely on blood flow per se, but it allows the pressure to flush out brain metabolites. Now, this also encourages this to happen when we're sleeping, because that's when our glymphatic system flushes sort of metabolic waste out of the brain. So high heat creating intracranial pressure from a high heat sauna impacts this. And I've done full videos on this. So what it looks like is taking a hot bath at a very hot temperature so that you can actually feel like you're getting the effect of a sauna, or going in a high heat sauna for 20 or 30 minutes about 2 hours before bed, a couple days per week. This next one is a little bit woo-woo, but I've got a weird option and a normal option. I'll start with the normal option. Regular endurance training, zone 2 to zone 3. Okay, sitting on an exercise bike or going for a run. This is very true when it comes down to BDNF. Okay, endurance work seems to be very powerful, particularly because of lactate. The same thing that makes you feel that burn, technically it's hydrogen, but it's kind of like misinterpreted and people call lactate the issue. Either way, point is that lactic acid, that lactate burn you get also has a benefit on the brain. Okay, so if you push yourself kind of to that anaerobic threshold a little bit, where you're kind of teetering between aerobic and anaerobic, you get that benefit. But a way to shortcut that is doing what is called BFR training, blood flow restriction training. Inexpensive option. For either a couple $100, you can get a high-end unit that actually has an electrical component that measures it properly, or for like $20, you can get a regular unit that you can just strap onto your arms and strap onto your legs. This isn't a video on BFR, but the point is doing higher repetitions, like 20, 30 reps with BFR, creates a lot of BDNF. Now this is very, very good for the brain, simply because the BFR produces more lactate, which in turn produces more BDNF, or triggers more BDNF for the brain. The next one sounds so funny. I prioritize fiber intake. Now, realistically, for wholeheartedly my entire body, I prioritize protein. But for the brain, I really do prioritize fiber intake. I consume a lot of flax. I consume a lot of psyllium. When I travel, I bring flax. I bring psyllium, because that's usually what ends up taking a hit. I usually have a hard time finding protein and a hard time finding good quality fiber. Do you realize that between 80 and 90% of the serotonin in your brain is produced in your gut? We have to remember that that gut-brain axis between our gut and our brain is huge. A healthy gut tends to lead to a healthy mind, and I focus on a diversity of my gut microbiome as much as possible. One of the things you may want to consider doing is adding a probiotic in as well. Simply when you're trying to add more fiber, you're trying to remodel the gut microbiome. I put a link down below for 25% off of Seed, which is my preferred probiotic. I don't typically recommend that people use probiotics a lot unless they're trying to make a change. I recommend you do it with fiber as much as you can, but sometimes you need a little help getting started. So it is what is called a synbiotic. It has a capsule inside of a capsule, so really interesting tech. Now they also are funding a lot of research on the gut-brain axis specifically for mental health, which makes them very unique in my mind, but also who doesn't like to save some money? So that 25% off discount link for Seed Daily Synbiotic is down below in the top line of the description. The next thing that I do is breath work or breath holds. Breath work is kind of a generic oversimplification, right? Like practicing your 4 in, 4 out, box breathing, whatever. But breath holds are very, very good for the brain. It sounds crazy because you sound like you're starving yourself of oxygen. But you got to realize that your innate need to breathe is not driven by a lack of oxygen. Your need to breathe is driven by a buildup of CO2. And if you can train the brain to deal with some breath holds, then the brain becomes a little bit more resilient, but also it allows you to be able to slow down your pace of breathing, which allows you to control your brain a little bit better, not to mention train yourself to get better oxygenation to the brain at better times. So you're not going to just get short, shallow breaths that are starving your brain. By doing breath holds, you open your diaphragm, you train yourself to be able to get deeper breaths. The next one, zero alcohol, not a drop. Alcohol is a huge problem. And when you look at the literature, modern literature since like 2021 is honestly suggesting that no amount of alcohol has health benefit. Not a drop, not a glass of wine, not a glass of deep red wine because of the resveratrol. The alcohol has zero benefit, goose egg. As a matter of fact, when you look at the brain, there are a lot of negative links between alcohol and neurodegenerative conditions, but also alcohol and short-term memory issues, short-term brain health, and not to mention a myriad of different things that are happening in the rest of the physical body. It's just not required. You don't need that to be a fun person. The next one is emptying your bucket. This sounds kind of generic, and in a way it kind of is, but emptying your bucket means doing something for yourself, and there's literature that backs this up as well. Okay, when you do things for yourself, you are prioritizing yourself and you become better at other things. It's plain and simple. And although it's one that sounds the most simple, it's also the one that most of us ignore, right? You have kids, you have a family. When is the last time you stepped away for a day and did something yourself? And don't tell me you can't do it, because if you prioritize it, you can make things happen and you can put things in place to make it happen. Next thing I do is I fast usually 2 days per week. For me, it's like 18, 20-hour fasts, but occasionally I'll do longer fasts. Now, does fasting have metabolic effect in the brain? Absolutely. Say fasting is going to strengthen your mitochondria, and the way that it does this is just like exercise. Okay, you are creating a hormetic stressor to where the mitochondria that produce energy in your brain become stronger and become more efficient at using fuel in scarcity. What that means is they become stronger and they become more efficient energy powerhouses. We forget that the bulk of our actual energy at rest is happening in our brain, right? We create a lot of energy. Something that weighs 2% of our entire body weight takes up 20 to 30% of our energy demand. Clearly, it's an energy hog. So why would we not prioritize energy manufacturing in the brain? And fasting is one of the ways that I've found to do that. Not to mention the way I feel while I fast is 100 times better than I feel when I don't fast mentally. So there's a short-term effect and a potential long-term benefit. The next thing is the occasional dopamine fast. I want you to make a list of 5 things that you find pleasure in the short term. Things like social media, things like alcohol, things like snacking, things like even fidgeting, right? Things that really dig deep in what you find gives you pleasure. Now with that, you should do a dopamine fast from that. Start with 30 minutes, go to 60 minutes, work your way up to a half a day, work your way up to an entire day. Things that bring you immense pleasure that you know are not necessarily adding benefit to your life. That doesn't mean that, hey, I like to listen to music, it brings me pleasure, you should ditch the music. But if music is getting you high or caffeine is getting you high, then occasionally turning it off and actually allowing your body to come back to that dopamine baseline, that is huge. Dopamine fasts have legitimate merit. Dr. Andrew Huberman talks about them. They're in various studies. They are a very real thing, even though they're trendy. Next one is more nutritional. Consuming things like fish oil or fish that have high amounts of DHA. So when you shop for a fish oil, shop for one that has a high amount of docosahexaenoic acid, DHA. Ideally, you want to have one that at least has a ratio of 1 or 2 to 1 EPA to DHA. 9 times out of 10, you're going to find a fish oil pill that has more EPA than DHA. That's perfectly acceptable and that's fine. But you do want to get that aggregate amount of DHA up because that is what increases that cell fluidity and that membrane fluidity in your brain. The more flexible and more sort of malleable the cell membrane is of a neuron, the better it can receive a signal. And DHA does just that. And the literature is so strong, especially when it comes down to beta amyloid plaque, when it comes down to tau proteins, when it comes down to neurofunction. This is a very real thing. So sardines, mackerel, anchovies, fish oil pills, whatever you got to do to get that DHA in. Algal oil, if you don't eat fish or you don't eat meat, is also another good option. This next one is one that I learned from Dr. Daniel Amen, a double board certified psychiatrist that has a very strong presence online as well. He taught me that you should, quote, never believe every stupid little thought that comes in your head. And what he taught me was that it's not the thoughts you have, it's the thoughts you attach to. And that is so potent and so powerful because thoughts are like popcorn. They just pop into our head all the time. Whether you choose to eat that popcorn is entirely up to you. A thought is just a thought is just a thought. It's not reality. It's a stupid thought. Next one is cruciferous vegetables. Dr. Rhonda Patrick talks about this quite a bit. She talks about the benefits of sulforaphane. Cruciferous vegetables, to name a few, you've got things like broccoli, you've got things like bok choy, you've got things like Brussels sprouts. You could do a quick Google search and find a lot of different cruciferous vegetables. They do 2 very important things. One, indole-3 carbinol. Very good for estrogen metabolism. Estrogen plays a role in the brain. If we can process and metabolize the bad estrogen, our brain typically feels a little bit better. Secondly, sulforaphane is one of the most potent antioxidants and endogenous antioxidant supporters and drivers of NRF2, which is an endogenous antioxidant system, kind of what kickstarts it, that you could possibly consume. So high amounts of this stuff. Broccoli sprouts, where it's more concentrated, is an even better route. I eat these things like crazy. If I have access to like hydroponic broccoli sprouts, I will devour them. And hydroponics are getting huge right now. And if you haven't invested in that kind of stuff for your home, it's an inexpensive way to get really high potency greens, and I definitely recommend it. And the last thing, one that I am very particular about, is I avoid mixing high fat and high carbohydrate foods together. And what I mean by that is hyper palatable stuff. Why is junk food so dangerous? It's not just because it's caloric. It's because it is impacting 2 separate regions of the brain. A region of the brain that registers from carbohydrates and gets excited, and a region of the brain that gets excited over high-fat foods. 2 different regions of the brain get stimulated by these. And when it happens together, it's like fireworks, an explosion in your brain that makes your brain feel like it can never achieve such a high ever again. And then you need more, and you need more, and you need more. So what do? I'm very conscious of that. I stay away from hyperpalatable foods, even if they're sweet from an artificial sweetener along with a fat. I'm still satisfying those 2 regions of the brain. It's still excitatory. It's still almost neurotoxic if you ask me. So I separate them a little bit, and I eat as close to the earth as possible. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel and take care of your brain.